Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Joe Simonetti. I am the Director of Mentorship and Education for the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. This is our monthly webinar series focused on collaborative, novel, cutting-edge work in the world of firearm injury prevention. Today, I am really thrilled to have our two speakers here today talking about a really fantastic topic. Briefly, Dr. Krista Mahari is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at University of Southern Alabama and a licensed clinical psychologist. She has expertise in youth violence prevention and participatory action research, which is one of the focuses of the talk today. Her work has been funded by the NIH, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and others. Dr. Philip Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of South Alabama. Dr. Smith is also the director of clinical training for the Clinical and Counseling Psychology Doctoral Program at USA. He's an expert in the understanding and prevention of suicide and serves as a co-investigator on Project GRIP, or gun-related injury prevention. With that, I want to welcome you both to present today. For those who are in the audience and attending, feel free to start entering things in the chat box in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the discussion during our conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. We're happy to be here. The goal of Project GRIP is to better understand people's attitudes, behaviors, and practices around guns so that we can inform effective and culturally relevant public health prevention strategies. But first, we think it's important to describe how our personal experiences inform our work and led us to take a participatory action approach to our research. I grew up in an area with high rates of gun violence. In our neighborhood, police were perceived more as the enemy than as a help, which has greatly informed my thinking about the disconnect between what we think should work to prevent violence and how those strategies are perceived by the communities that they are supposed to serve.
I grew up in an area where guns and gun ownership were common, and my house was no different. As a child, shooting guns was part of what we did for fun. I'm still a gun owner and involved in a lot of activities involving guns, including hunting and competitive shooting. For the last 15 years, though, I've also been involved in suicide prevention as a researcher, mental health professional, and supervisor and mentor to graduate students in psychology. I've always noticed a disconnect between how suicide prevention people talk about guns and the way that gun owners talk about mental health and suicide. So this disconnect is a big problem in finding common ground and reducing gun-related deaths. Our experiences highlight that the problem isn't just that violence occurs. The problem is that violence occurs and there's a communication gap and a cultural divide between the people working to reduce violence and those at risk for being involved in violence. We designed Project GRIP to bridge the communication gap between these different worlds. Now, we also want to bridge the gap in research on suicide and interpersonal violence, as we view these issues as potentially sharing some common causes. As part of these goals, we're developing a culturally grounded socio-ecological model based on the lived experiences of people who own and use guns or who are living in communities that are disproportionately burdened by violence. We believe that by understanding gun-related attitudes, behavior, and practices that might place individuals at risk for intentional gun-related injury should be informed by a framework that is attentive to the multiple interacting systems and contexts in which these injuries and deaths occur. Now, such an understanding will not only help us better understand risk for gun-related injury, but also inform our ability to develop more culturally valid and acceptable strategies to reduce gun-related death. To accomplish this, we're using a participatory action research approach that involves members of the impacted communities in all aspects of the research process, as lead investigators, research assistants, advisory board members, and study participants. The communities of focus include firearm owners, people living in areas with high rates of community violence, and people in both groups. Within this participatory action research approach, we're using a mixed methods two-phase design. First, we recruited 3 advisory boards that met monthly in the beginning of the project and quarterly after the first 6 months. These included young adults living in areas of high rates of violence, gun owners, and community leaders in our region. We also hired members of the communities of focus to be on the research team. And our advisory board members and our research assistants have had vital roles across all aspects of the project throughout. As part of phase one, we collaboratively developed our qualitative interview protocol with our advisory boards and research team. They guided the identification of information that we need, the phrasing of the questions to get that information, our recruitment strategies, and our interpretation of incoming data. The community research assistants also are the ones who conducted the interviews. In phase two, we developed surveys based on the new information revealed in the qualitative interviews, again, in collaboration with our advisory boards and research team. We're currently administering those surveys to a nationally representative sample of adults and a sample of high school aged youth. Krista, I think you're muted.
Just realized that, thank you. Consistent with a participatory action approach, we've been working to not only build knowledge, but to also build community around the shared mission of reducing violence. We've been able to serve as a resource in the community and to be visible and present as an entity that's highly motivated to reduce gun violence. In these pictures, you can see some of our community research assistants at various events. And just to give you a glimpse into our team, I want to highlight Brian in the middle, who is one of the first community research assistants we hired. He had been shot in his neighborhood and then chose to purchase the gun that he is currently showing to Chris after that. His story represents a lot of the stories that we've heard. So the process that we've taken is that we train our community research assistants in interviewing. They are matched with participants who are members of their same group. And then they conduct about an hour-long interview with those participants at the participants' location of choice. We have purposely sampled members of demographic groups who are more likely to sustain a gun injury. In areas with rates of high violence, that group is predominantly Black boys and young men. Among gun owners, that group is predominantly middle-aged and older white men. And you can see how far along we are in our recruitment strategy in that table. So briefly, what have we learned so far? We found a lot of similarities in the types of risk factors, experiences, and contexts between those at risk for interpersonal violence and those at risk for suicide, even beyond a common means of firearms. First, we want to highlight some of what we learned about the practices and motivations around ownership and use, storage and safety, and carrying. So here you can see a glimpse of some of the themes that we collected around people's gun ownership and use. And there's a couple of these themes that I want to highlight. Protection was by far the most common theme that individuals across the spectrum endorsed as a need. So for example, one quote, just to protect the people I love more than anything, and to protect myself at the same time. Another common theme was socio-political reasons. For example, we have an inalienable right given to us by God. God tells us to protect ourselves. We have a right set forth by our forefathers of the United States to protect ourselves with the Second Amendment against tyrannical government and those people who would wish to cause us harm. These are some of the factors that we learned about that have influenced how people choose to store. We learned a lot of different storage practices that people have. Probably the most common theme that has come up is that people say they put it up in referring to their guns, and that usually means someplace that's out of sight, but not secured in any way. And this is believed to be the best way to, or a good way at least, to keep the guns away from children. So for example, if you have kids, they could get the gun and play with it or whatever, so you should put it up from them. We often heard a lot of just keeping it in the home unsecured in general. And some reasons for this are related to safety from outsiders people like to barge in or break the doors or something. And that's when you protect your family. That's why I keep my sidearm by the bed. We also learned a lot about individuals' practices around carrying. One of the main reasons that we've heard is around protection. You're carrying, it's for my safety of me and my children and my wife, and I don't use it unless I have to. We've also heard a lot about carrying as default. It's almost like you have your keys, you have your wallet, you have your phone, you have your gun. One participant said, one of my homeboys, everywhere he go, he makes sure he have it on him. If I don't have mine, he have his on him.
So we're interested in understanding the systemic factors that we think explain people's attitudes and practices around guns, and subsequently how these might put them at risk for gun-related injury. So we're going to step back now and look into those systems. So in our qualitative data, culture and chronosystemic factors, that is events in time that impact systems, have been front and center in people's decision-making. So for example, values on the Second Amendment and the transition to a democratic president created an increased concern about access to guns and presenting institutions as threats. Similarly, police-involved racial violence has also increased the intensity of feelings of society being a threat. So for example, in this quote, I'm more worried about, race relations in this country, anything. That's probably my biggest concern. We have a gun in the house, but with race relations going on in this world, I want to get some sticks. I want to get some choppas and load. I want to get arsenals, man, because they come this way. I want to be ready. People also talked about values against seeking help for mental health, including this example, it's a pride. Don't nobody want to talk to nobody because people are going to talk about you. People want to use that against you, everything. People are basically scared to go into deep details and stuff. Participants described a number of macro system factors relevant for intentional gun-related injury, including experiences and beliefs about political and judicial systems, communities, health systems, and educational systems. People talked about a lack of social connectedness and belonging, resources, and trust in institutions. They also described that a reduced sense of safety and vulnerability to violence in society is really highly relevant. So for example, this quote, say you're going somewhere that you're not used to being, not familiar, but like you just go to like a block party or something, and you're not used to seeing any doggone people. I'm gonna have it in the car with me. I'm not gonna have it on me, but if I need to go get it, I know where I got to go. This notion of safety also extended to the school context as well. So them playing like they can get them killed because they say, I'm gonna shoot somebody. And instead of that person going to the principal, to the teacher, they go get their gun because they can go and shoot them first. Now, whereas macro systems refer to larger societal systems, microsystems are the collection of local groups and organizations that individuals are embedded in. And our participants talked a lot about families and family functioning across several domains as relevant. So for example, this quote, when I was 15, I tried to commit suicide. It didn't pan out. So whenever I came home, they stuck a gun, my dad and my brother took a 12 gauge and stuck it in my mouth and told me to pull the trigger if I wanted to die so bad. That way I wouldn't miss this time. So this quote is a really tragic thing to hear and read. This illustrates not only an instance of family abuse and violence, but also role modeling norms and how about gun use and the message about mental health, among many other things, I think is particularly relevant for how people come to experience guns and then related risk for gun injury. Similarly, peer and friend groups were described as exerting a strong influence on risky gun-related behaviors. So there's people at my school who carry, like people my age. And of course, it's not legal, but of course I could call them and be like, hey, I need a gun. So it'd be very easy to get one. We've heard a common theme that many view gun carrying as a normative thing. And even if they themselves don't carry regularly, they know how to acquire guns or know people that do. So the categories and themes we're hearing characterize really a complex and nuanced picture of how culture, social systems, and local systems might influence risky gun-related behavior. And also, some of these themes are not in and of themselves novel. Researchers, in our view, tend to stick to their own lane when considering how the multiple levels and systems interact, that these interactions influence greatly the individual person's experience. And while it's our argument that an attempt to understand risk for injury with an exclusive focus on the individual is unlikely to be ultimately useful, the individual does remain the most proximal level to gun-related injury. And our participants talked a lot about some very common individual level factors related to how they understood risk for violence and suicide. Things like negative life events, exposure to violence and suicide, and mental health difficulties. In terms of gun ownership and use, though, we've also heard about beliefs regarding protection and the imperative to defend yourself, your stuff, and your family. So things like I said before, guns are important in the protection of your home and your property and even your family. I've also found it really interesting how some of this need for protection was, at least how I interpret it, a potential reflection of like post-traumatic stress symptoms and sort of this general view of the world that's been influenced by trauma. So for example, this quote, you're more on guard. Either somebody is looking for you or, you just got to get in an argument with someone, something has happened and you're just so paranoid. You're like, okay, now you want to tangle with everything. Crystal?
Sorry, I was figuring out how to unmute first this time. We really neglect the idea of interactions. Our research highlights factors at multiple levels, the interaction between factors at multiple levels, and some degree of randomness. But we like simple explanations. So for example, one mentor told me that once that you're more likely to get published in a journal like JAMA if you can reduce what you found to a headline. And I wonder if that need for simplicity is why we as a culture have focused on the simplest possible explanations for gun violence. It's the bad people or it's the bad guns. As a society, we want a single factor explanation and a magic cure to stop it. We need to focus more on how all these factors across systems interact to create a context that increases the likelihood for gun-related violence or gun-related suicide. We also need to think about the situations that precipitate the incidence of gun-related violence and suicide. In our interviews, we've learned about things such as unsupervised time with peers, parties or social events, alcohol and other drugs, road rage, social disconnectedness, and proximal stressors that precipitate episodes involving gun-related injuries. So for example, one participant described a fight between their sister and the sister's boyfriend. My sister and her boyfriend were fighting. They were both drunk. She put his ass out. He left, he came back. He tried to climb through the window and she was standing there with a shotgun. She walked. She got stand her right in Texas. And she walked meant she was not convicted of homicide. And another participant described their nephew's completed suicide. He was upset about, he thought his girlfriend was seeing someone else, so he shot himself in the head in a car. Made no sense. We need more studies that can start to characterize these immediate precipitants to these violent deaths. And finally, as we've been talking with more and more people, our team and advisory boards have been struck by a feeling that there is some randomness or chaos or unpredictability, such that these contexts and these situations exist, but those measurable factors don't explain everything. For example, one woman told us how she got shot because her boyfriend had driven her car through this one neighborhood, and people thought he was someone else they were trying to get. So then the next time they saw her car, this time when she was driving, they shot it up. This was so random and unpredictable that it happened, and simultaneously a miracle that she survived. Similar stories have happened so much. For example, you're walking to your car and you end up in a situation where you get shot in an altercation between two other people. We've started to develop shorthand for this as a team. Wrong place, wrong time. We hear similar themes for completed suicides from the survivors, that there was a constellation of risk, but that step from risk to death seemed triggered in some inexplicable way. We've started to use the word dysergy to describe this phenomenon. So many different factors coming together at a particular moment in time, but then are triggered in some intangible way, resulting in death or injury. We need a much deeper understanding of that interaction between factors that lead up to actual violence, and what domains of factors move the situation from risk to reality. We also need more negative case analysis to understand the situations when dysergy does not happen, when all the risk is there, but fatalities and injuries are avoided. And as you might imagine, this secondary exposure to violence and suicide as a research team, and in many cases, our direct exposure to these situations, and combined with a sense of dysergy, can intermittently cause hopelessness and helplessness. Feels like trying to hold back a storm. We notice in ourselves the desire to create a sense of safety by telling ourselves different stories. The stories we tell ourselves as a society are driven by a need for safety. I need to be safe from dangerous people, or I need to be safe from dangerous guns. It's possible that the reason we focus on individual level factors or on policy is because we want to focus on those things that we potentially have direct control over. We want to also individually, we want to focus on how I am different from those other people who have been injured or killed. We urgently need to expand our view and think about factors across systems levels, the interaction between systems and the systems that increase and the situations that increase the risk for violent injury and death. And we also want to identify the common ground that we have, that everyone who we've been talking to wants to be safe. And even though our perspectives about how to get to safety are different, we can unite in that desire to save lives. We want to again thank in particular our community research assistants who may or may not be more fundamental to the success of this project than any of the investigators. And we also want to thank our advisory board members and our partnering agencies who've made it possible to have an in-depth look into what might be contributing to the problem. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I had just a couple of sort of thoughts and questions. Before that, I'll just say, folks in the audience, you're welcome to use the Q&A board. You can also add to the chat or chat directly to me if you have questions or comments that I can relay to our presenters. So again, thank you. So really sort of fantastic and striking. I think I saw your sample size was over 100 people. That is just like a tremendous effort to get that many people involved in this work. Not really a question, it's just more of a statement of shock, and that's a lot of work. It's really fascinating when you think about fire injury.
Sorry, I'm just gonna pop in. I think it's been about 200 now, which is, and we are grateful for all of the research assistants who have done
I miscounted. It's a fantastic effort. It's so novel what you're doing. We think of firearm injury and violence as sort of in these buckets of interpersonal or unintentional or law enforcement related. And I think your approach is like really novel in thinking about the things that are like between different types of intent rather than the things that are different. I'm curious, you talked about the role of community research assistants and the people who are helping to facilitate this work. I had two questions. How do you find them? Like, how do you know somebody is the right person to do this work? I think that's a question we struggle with a lot in participatory action research or stakeholder engagement. Maybe another sort of different framework we could think about. And then once you have them, how do you support them? This is hard work, right? I mean, it can be stressful, it can be traumatizing. You're dealing with the traumatized community. So how do you find them? And then how do you support them while they're doing what they're doing?
I can answer the how we find them question, and then Phil would maybe be more effective in the how we support them question. Um, the so we've been lucky, and one thing is that I've been doing violence prevention work in this particular community for a while. So we've been able to use our partnerships with other agencies like community centers, boys and girls clubs, schools, where we can reach out to principals or directors of after school sites and say, hey, we're doing this project. Can you send anyone you know our way? And we've also been trying to pay a decent amount and make sure that we are adequately compensating people, because one of the things that we're looking for is lived experience, and that's a different kind of job. And we would argue deserves like more compensation.
Yeah, I think those two, as well as we have a really strong team. And when interviewing people for these positions, I think Chris and I are very much of the same mind of wanting to develop a team that is diverse in thought, but unified around our mission. And being able to find people that can come in and check their biases at the door and have conversations with people with different perspectives. It's been really good because it's created a really strong team. And we've been able to sustain that. I think that team is in many ways how we support each other too, through those relationships and conversations and engagement. One of the community research assistants was reflecting at a recent meeting that even though some of the legwork on the interviews is going to be coming to an end in the not too distant future, he was going to really miss going out and doing stuff and being with the team and engaging with the community partners. Now this project is also funded by the CDC, and they've been gracious enough to let us actually support directly some of our research assistants through supporting mental health services through grant dollars. So that's been a really helpful thing that we've been able to make that available to our team.
So thank you. So sort of stemming, maybe related to your comment about, folks have different ideas, but you have a common goal. One of the questions is, while the news is increasingly covering gun violence, it seems like gun violence is becoming an epidemic in the US. It's a very political conversation. So how do you navigate this as an obstacle to research, or navigate this within your team?
I guess I can start speaking to that. So I've always felt like I occupy this sort of weird place where growing up and being involved in gun culture and honestly having a lot of friends and associates who are strong 2A, strongly politically conservative. It's how we approach it. I think it's recognizing that there's a reason we all believe the things we do, trying to find sort of at least intellectual empathy for why people that disagree with us believe what they do. And then often stepping back to that common ground. But I don't think all of us want people to die. And I think the majority of people would agree that saving lives is a useful goal. And if we can come back to that, have interesting conversations and respect each other, I think we can move forward. That's hard, I think, in politics, where things get really challenging. But at least individually, we've been pretty successful, I think, in that.
And a follow-up question, do you see this program translating to the families, members of active or inactive military? If so, can you talk a little bit about how it might do so?
That's an interesting question. We have actually had multiple members of the military be involved as research assistants or consultants, active duty and reserves, and of course then as participants, retired sometimes also. And we also kind of relatedly have been trying to over-recruit among first responders in general, who also present a higher risk for suicide. So what we're hoping is, I would first say that we don't have programming in place yet. So we haven't developed any intervention yet based on what we've learned. But we're hoping that given that all of the information people who are members of the military have had a voice in the information that we're receiving and in the interpretation of the information that we're receiving. We're hoping that there will be useful implications for programming.
Thank you. Dr. Mahar, you had this cool concept. You were talking about dysergy for a little while there. And that was really fascinating. And how you might study these events through negative case analysis. And I'm just like curious, have you had any thoughts about how you would do that? So it's really fascinating. We always think about, again, positive outcomes. And so we study gun ownership, but we don't spend a whole lot of time studying the folks who decide not to own firearms. But that's sort of like a static trait, right? You seem to be referring to these really dynamic situations that didn't end as badly as they could have. Like, how do you capture that? That sounds really
I would zoom out a little bit and then go into the dynamic situations. So even in our conversations, we've talked to people who used to carry as default and then decided to say like, oh, my temper is too quick for this. I don't want to be going around killing anybody, and I know I will if I keep carrying. And we've heard that from multiple respondents. We've also heard people who move from ownership to not ownership for similar reasons, that either they don't trust themselves with guns, or they started having kids, or their grandchildren started to be coming over more. So there is that decision-making process. And then also within these moments in time, I think some is potentially identifiable and some might just be random. So for example, if you're next to somebody who a person is shooting at, and they happen to shoot you as opposed to the person they're shooting at, is it just a matter of the person's aim? Is there another factor, non-random factor that predicts? But then it also seems like there are factors that could be related to mood, or having a pleasant conversation earlier that day, or that last minute thought of maybe I shouldn't do this, clicking in, and you end up not going to that party, or not going to that place. And so when I'm talking about dysergy, it feels, at least as a team, when we're talking about it, it feels like it could be so mild from that idea of, did this person have breakfast that day? But predictable potentially to things that feel almost completely at random. And so when we're thinking about that negative case analysis, it's hard to know. It almost is talking to folks who have the same level of risk, but who haven't gotten shot and haven't shot somebody. So when we're talking to the folks in the community, what seems to be the difference between the people who live in those kinds of neighborhoods that are disproportionately burdened by violence, who have had the same family risk factors, had the same peer risk factors, shared the same cultural risk factors, but for some reason, they haven't gotten injured, and their next door neighbor did. And so thinking through in these conversations with people, making sure we're talking to both the people who have directly been victimized or directly perpetrated, as well as the people who have not.
That's really fascinating. You know, I do a lot of work in the VA, and so a lot of our work is trying to train clinicians in engaging veterans with elevated suicide risk to make different decisions about their firearms, even if temporarily. And I think we anchor a lot on how hard that conversation is. What we don't think we pay enough attention to are the folks that have already made that decision for themselves. And so in some of our qualitative interviews, we'll actually ask, why don't you have a gun? And the answer is, that's not good for our house. Like, we know it. And there's really been no work in that area. So that's very cool. So you mentioned you had gotten feedback at one point that if you want to publish in a high impact journal, you need to be able to reduce it to a headline. And like, such a great comment, because you're right. When we read the media, so much of what is being sort of posited as the solutions to gun injury seem to be boiled down to the headline, and we all know it's complex in that. How do you communicate what you're finding to people who don't work in science? How do you not necessarily boil it down to a headline, but explain what you're talking about to people who, you know, have not had any exposure to this content?
I think one metaphor, I can't do it well directly. The metaphor that I can often think of is pregnancy or STI prevention. So the really simple, effective solution to not getting pregnant would be to not have sex. And some people in the country are really supporting that idea, like that abstinence is the way to reduce teenage pregnancy. And we know that that's actually not effective. So what does it look like to have a little bit more flexible problem solving around the other ways to reduce pregnancy, teenage pregnancy or unwanted pregnancy, or the other ways to reduce STIs without just going to, if you don't want to get pregnant, don't have sex. And so like we're trying to think about gun injuries in that way too. Is there more to it than just not having guns? Is it that more to it than crazy people not having guns, which is often a solution that we hear too? And so how can we think about it in a more nuanced way?
I think going off on that too, when I think about like what the culture around having guns, and there's a lot of different versions of that, of course. One of the things that really excites me about this project is looking at that idea of culture and really getting a deeper dive into what people think and believe and do. Because I don't know if that's modifiable, but in my view, a lot of the gun owners I interact with are some of the safest people I know. I go to shooting competitions where every one of us is carrying a gun all day long, but there's so much safety involved in that. I would like to think about whether we can expand that notion of responsible gun ownership and safety, which people do identify with, like they hold that strongly to them as a part of who they are, to include the use against other, use against self. Like I think those are things that if we can make bigger cultural shifts that are more foundational to how people use guns, we could see downstream stuff and save lives over time, of course.
All right, well, thank you both. I think that wraps up the questions. I just want to say one more time, I really appreciate you being here today. I think this work is fantastic and timely and much needed within the violence and injury prevention field. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Of course. Thank you all for attending. You all have a nice day.